Hello, today I'm going to get into something a little bit on the deep side. It's the Exegesis of Philip K and Gnosticism. Its sort of relation to Gnosticism. If you benefit from anything in this video, you can like and subscribe or hit the bell for notifications. And if you want to share this video, if you know anyone that's interested in Philip K. Dick or Gnosticism, it would help my channel a lot. Well, first off, I'm going to say that this is a profound work, and anyone that knows Philip K. Dick's stories, if they haven't read this, I highly recommend reading it because it will change. It's almost like the key to all of his work. And he's mainly known as a science fiction writer, and there have been many films based upon his work, and he was quite prolific as well. But I think his work transcends science fiction. It dives into like identity and a lot of Gnostic ideas, and also the idea of anamnesis, which I'll mention a bit later. But I think what he's brilliant at is taking these lofty ideas and distilling them into kind of pulp fiction, I guess. And it's brilliant the way he does that, because if you didn't know these things, you would just read it as a very interesting story, and a story kind of about like amnesia and like lost identity and humanity, what it means to be human, things like that. But at a deeper core, there's much more to his stories. So I'm going to start by reading the synopsis of the book. Philip K. Dick's Exegesis is a sprawling, posthumously published collection of the prolific science fiction writer's personal writings, notes, and reflections. Compiled after Dick's death in 1982, the Exegesis delves into his intense experiences with altered states of consciousness, mystical visions, and a perceived encounter with a transcendent intelligence. The work explores themes such as the nature of reality, the existence of God, and the interplay between subjective experience and objective reality. It provides a deep and introspective journey into his mind, offering insights into the profound philosophical and metaphysical questions that fueled his creative and contemplative endeavors. I'm going to also say a little bit about what influenced this work, what kind of inspired it. On February 20th, 1974, Philip K. Dick had a profound and transformative experience that he later described as a series of mystical visions and encounters. According to Dick's accounts, the experience began when he was recovering from oral surgery at home. As he received pain medication, he suddenly felt a surge of divine presence and had a series of intense visionary episodes. Okay, so if you don't know the story, he was at his home and he was recovering from this surgery on his teeth. I believe it was his wisdom teeth were pulled or impacted or something. So he was on some painkillers, and a woman came to the door, knocked on his door. And if you know anything about him, you know that he was very paranoid. He claimed that like the FBI was breaking into his safe and kind of monitoring him, and it could be true. But he also did a lot of amphetamine and speed, so like maybe he was also very just paranoid. I don't know. But he opened the door, and this woman was there, and she had the Vesica Pisces necklace on of the Jehovah's Witness. He sort of looked at her, and the light came in from the sun, and it kind of reflected off of this sort of fish-looking symbol, right? And it flashed into his eyes, and he had this like epiphany where he was back in Rome. Jesus Christ had just been sacrificed not too long before that, and that he was a secret Christian, and that he was trying not to be killed by the kind of inquisition that was happening at the time for Christians. because at that time the Roman Empire had not embraced Christianity yet, so they were kind of like outlaws. And if you know anything about like the Gnostics, a lot of them were persecuted and killed for their beliefs. So it's not crazy that he would think that. But what is interesting is that he describes it as like layers of reality kind of unpeeled, and suddenly he could see ultimate reality very clearly and who he actually was. And this informed a lot of his work. And I think, if you look at his later work, like the Divine Invasion or VALIS or the Transmigration of Timothy Archer, there are a lot of... It kind of leans away from science fiction. It becomes more like mystical allegory or something, based upon his experiences that day and some other experiences he had later. And he dived in to writing the story. I wouldn't call it a story. It's more like a series of essays, but it does kind of tell a story, even though I don't think he ever intended it to be published. It almost has this sort of saintly vibe, and I don't mean that in the case of like the way we think of it when we talk about saints. I'm not saying he's trying to help anybody or do that. It's more him sorting through his kind of revelations that he had and trying to find answers to it in the works of others. He mentions lots and lots of philosophers and Gnostics, and pretty much from every literary realm, let's say, philosophy, history, everything. And he's kind of examining all these different threads to try to figure out what happened to him. And it's fascinating as a human being in general. As someone that loves books, it's even more fascinating, but just on a basic level, it's kind of a gift that he wrote all this stuff, because then we can kind of go through it and try to make heads or tails of it. And some of it is very abstract. I can almost imagine him being awake very late at night, and not being able to sleep or something, and just coming up with all these diagrams and these different kinds of analysis about what actually happened to him. He devoted so much time to unraveling this, but that the finished work is more than 900 pages, which is quite an achievement, especially since he wasn't really intending it to be published. But some of the things that he talks about in this extensively is the idea of the ego and transcending the ego. And he mentions a lot of Gnostic ideas like the Demiurge. And if you don't know what the Demiurge is, it's the spirit in Gnosticism that thinks it's God, the true God, but there is a it's deluded that it thinks it's the real God, that there's actually a true light behind that God. So if you think about it in terms of the ego and our true self, like the ego is kind of the Demiurge, and our true self is like the real God, let's say, the one behind the ego. And he also talks about anamnesis, and I have another video on it where I talk more in depth about anamnesis. But basically it means the recovery of what we've forgotten. So like when you're born, you lose all memory of your eternal self, and through life you're trying to recover knowledge. So you don't really learn knowledge, you actually just recover it. It's kind of a fascinating concept, but he talks about it a lot in this book. He also discussed the prison of materiality, which is a very Gnostic concept. The Gnostics kind of believed that most religions believe that this is kind of like the middle place between heaven and hell, let's say. But the Gnostics kind of saw the material world as a kind of hell. When I mean hell, I don't mean like fire and brimstone, but I mean our eternal selves are free, our spirit, but then the matter, the material, traps spirit, almost like glue or some kind of substance that sticks it and traps it here. And then we have to kind of deal with this conundrum that we're in, where we are material beings, but we're also spiritual beings. And the more that we discover our spiritual selves, the more free we are from this material prison. One of the concepts that is kind of like addressed is called the Pleroma, which basically means like the line between the material and the spiritual, or the world that the Demiurge created, which is an illusion, and the true world, which is a world of light and of transcendence and the divine sort of spiritual realm, the unknowable, let's say. And he had many glimpses of the Pleroma during his life. His 1974 experience being the most profound, but I think in general people have this, it happens a lot. I've had my own, and other people I've known have had some experiences like this. I'm not saying everybody does. Maybe some people are closer to the material world, let's say, or more in need of it, where other people are kind of shirking it or shrugging it away, I guess. And maybe when we die, that is us sort of being free to go back to this other realm. But this dualistic cosmology really addresses what his struggle in life, and you see that in this book, that he is definitely struggling. I think someone of his intellectual level, they say ignorance is bliss, and I think he's kind of the opposite. So like the more that he delved into this, the more aware he became, but also the more haunted, I guess, he became by his experiences. Partly because I think when you're glimpsing this other world, you're glimpsing something that's perfect. And then you realize how flawed the material world is. And that's kind of like the idea of Gnosticism, is that this deluded God has created this world, and he thinks he's the God that created it, but there's actually a higher God. So he's deluded, but we're deluded by his delusion. And then it just shows the flaws in sort of the plan, let's say. So he talks a lot about gnosis, which is kind of the knowing of the divine spark, I guess. And it's this exploration of his salvation, let's say. And I don't really mean that in the Christian context. I mean it more in... You have to understand that in this book, it's almost like an inner battle he's fighting. And it appears to be quite exhausting. And I think maybe it's a battle that we all kind of have, but in his case, it's exponentially made greater and greater the more that he dives into this. And in a way, he gets a kind of enlightenment from it, but it also makes him more haunted or condemned, maybe, because he keeps saying that the reality we live in is deceptive. It's this illusion. He questions the world around him constantly, not just physical authoritarianism, like through governments and things, but also he believes that there are these archons or powers, which is a Gnostic idea. They're kind of like lower beings that are below the Demiurge. They're kind of ruler. In fact, the word anarchist comes from the opposite of an archon, so anarchon, right? So it means kind of like fighting against the rulers. but he sees these kind of oppressive entities, and when he talks about it, it's not like these are physical or anything. It's like these kind of forces, and he constantly refers to the black iron prison, which is what he sees this world as, but we're not aware of it. Like, he catches these glimmers of the prison, which he kind of correlates to like 70 AD Rome, basically, and that we're still there, and that everything that we are experiencing now is more of the illusion. Because of this, he has this kind of tension between the dualism of these two worlds, and it almost kind of tears them apart as you're reading this. But some of the things that he focuses most on is the Sophia Myth, which in Gnosticism is this idea of a kind of feminine wisdom that we are experiencing in this prison, and that it can kind of lead us out of the prison. And he has many characters in many of his books that kind of represent this force. Ella in Ubik is one. Sophia in A Maze of Death is another. Junie in The Divine Invasion. Pris in We Can Build You. Donna in Scanner Darkly. All of these characters are kind of like this ideal archetype, almost muse, I guess, that helps the protagonist learn about this conspiracy. Let's call it conspiracy. And he has a name for this kind of reality we live in, and in one way he calls it VALIS, which means the vast active living intelligence system. And he also talks about the zebra principle, which I think it's kind of both things, the Demiurge and the true God. He talks about how it has this ability to do mimicry. And obviously the zebra idea is black and white, you know. And he says that this principle is like benign, that it is there and it's aware of what's going on, but it doesn't really interfere. And I think that's why a lot of people don't believe in Christianity, because they think that there's this God that's going to do brimstone or interfere with the world, and they don't ever actually see that in reality. And I think he also was like that, where he sees God as almost a detached thing that's just kind of there. And in fact, I think he almost saw it as like a superior life form that we live inside of. Anyway, he gets deep into all of that stuff, and it's very fascinating. Maybe too deep to go into a video because it's 900 pages of it. But all in all, I think one day, maybe not in the near future, but way in the future, people are going to look back at his experiences and see him as kind of almost a prophet or something. You know, he just did the science fiction writing to make money, but like his ideas are much bigger than that, I think. As far as how I use his ideas in my own life, I think I've been quite influenced by him to look into Gnosticism more, like the Gnostic Gospels and other books about that. I'll say this, if he is correct in all of his assumptions in this book, then what we live in is not what people think it is. And the older I get, the more I think that maybe he's onto something, and I think that maybe our job in this black iron prison is to do anything we can to glimpse the true reality. And I think that's hard to do, but I think it's not impossible. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. If you are like a cursory fan, it might be too much for you, but if you like his work, I think it's well worth a dive into. I am a big fan of his work, so it was kind of a logical step for me to get into this. But Yeah, I mean, I think, when people see the movies and they read some of his work, I don't think they really understand like the level of depth and commitment he had to this exploration. In fact, I think if you read this, I think you realize that it was basically his obsession. Yeah, that's all I got. If you respond to anything in here, if you like it, you can like the video and subscribe if you want to. If you want to hear more about different things I discuss, if you have fans of Philip K. Dick that you know that might benefit from this, you can send it to them. And yeah, that's about it. Take care. I'll see you next time.